Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you. I haven't had a chance to welcome the Congress participants in total, and I'm happy to do so. This is a wonderful occasion for all of us. And one of the great things here at Georgia Tech is actually that people get together from different schools, from different departments across campus and collaborate and discuss matters that are important to all of them. And many of them. And this is one of those occasions because this event is actually sponsored by such a group of people. We call it ICLAST. And so we have conversations about all kinds of things. And they also make it possible for us to learn what everybody else on campus is doing. And to engage with their research paradigms, with their points of view, with their backgrounds. Today, we're doing something as part of that series, which is also part of the conference. And we've kind of geared the campus question, which is open access in general, to medievalism and medieval studies. And the only thing that I really want to do is to say that 20 years ago, if open access had existed, the field of medievalism would have advanced and developed in vastly different ways from the ones that many of us, have experienced. Rejections by journals, rejections by the scholars in medieval studies, all of these things have happened, and with open access, that could have been quite a different situation. But that's just a preliminary remark. I think everybody should introduce themselves as they speak so we don't lose a lot of time. I'm really grateful to Fred Rascoe from the library and Britt Holbrook from public policy for bringing this issue to the conference and the rest of us, and to everybody else who agreed to kind of gearing that discussion towards medievalism and medieval studies. Thank you.
Welcome everyone. Just real quick to introduce ourselves. As Richard said, I'm Fred Rascoe from the library. I'm scholarly communications librarian, which means that I help your scholarly work get publicly accessible and more widely disseminated. Britt?
I'm Britt Holbrook. I'm from the School of Public Policy here at Georgia Tech. My background, I have a PhD in philosophy. So just since you all are a different group from me, just so you know my identity. And so I actually, in talking to Fred about this, we want it to be a conversation, not really, we don't have any planned presentations. We want it to be a conversation. We send some questions around to our panel members, but we do want to encourage audience participation. So if you've got a question, please put your hand up and we'll get you involved in the conversation as quickly as possible. Also, being a philosopher, one of the first things I want to do is talk about the definition of open access and say that, in fact, I'm not sure that we all agree what we're talking about when we talk about open access. I just got an email yesterday about some European Commission reports that outlined at least 11 different definitions of open access. One with which we may all be familiar, which happened, I think, before the movement of open access really got going, is something that they term Robin Hood open access. And their definition of that is people putting their stuff online and making it freely available despite copyright agreements. I tend to think of open access as something that happens within the law, but still has a kind of Robin Hood motive. And for me, in particular, as a scholar, I like to look at it as a way to try to exercise my freedom to publish where I want, when I want, and have my work openly available to anyone who wants to read it, which to me sounds like, in general, a good thing, but can raise all kinds of sticky issues that hopefully we'll get into today. So I won't go through all 11 definitions of open access. Basically, we're dealing with something like different ways of making your work accessible to people and making it easily accessible and freely accessible.
My definitions of open access in the library world, we also have lots. There are people that argue about it. Whether something is just available freely, is that open access, or is it only open access if you can take it, if you can reuse it and remix it somehow? I know there's been some sessions this morning about remixing medievalism culture, and open access, there's definitely a proponent where they believe that open access is only open access if you can remix and reuse that scholarly work to your benefit to create more scholarly work. So we don't have to debate which open access definition we want to talk about, but maybe we can talk about with the panelists what their perceptions of open access are.
And please do say who you are and your affiliation so that people know.
So, Paul, would you like to start?
Oh, okay. I'm starting. Oh, right. All right. Hi. I'm Paul Sturtevant. My affiliation is complicated, much like relationship statuses on Facebook or something. Let's see. I am working both for the Smithsonian Institution and the Office of Policy and Analysis. I am also the managing editor for Curator of the Museum Journal, which is most decidedly not open access, I'm afraid. And also sort of my spare time hat, which is actually possibly just as, if not more, relevant to this conversation, is that I'm the developer and head writer and editor for the Public Medievalist, which is an online web, whatever you want to call it, web magazine, web platform for essentially articles that have to do with public history, medievalism, anything relating to the intersection of the past and present, the medieval world. And we're always looking for contributions, by the way. Hint, hint. It's publicmedievalist.com. So should I just, some thoughts? Okay.
Yeah.
So I have very different reactions to the idea of open access based upon those two hats. One as managing editor for Curator, and one as doing this really nerdy thing online under my own steam. There's a lot of differences between the two. Some are very obvious and some less obvious. The biggest distinction between the two is one of them I get paid for and one of them I don't. And I know that that's glib and funny, but it's important in this discussion, actually. Because one of the big problems with open access, as far as I can tell, is about authority and about credibility. And to a certain degree, credibility comes with, to some degree, credibility comes with hiring professionals who know what they're doing in terms of actually creating, managing, editing, and producing content. Because I think that content producers, such as all of us, but such as myself as well, we have this lovely and wonderful idea that so long as we produce the content, that everything else will kind of fall into place. And my work on Curator has led me to the uncomfortable conclusion that very often the medium is the message. And so if we are going to be doing online open access content, in order to have the credibility that will give it the kind of respect in academia that is necessary for hiring committees and for tenure committees, and even just for each other, not to say, oh, well, he's just only publishing online open access. He's not in, he's not in speculum, that kind of thing. This idea that we're ranking each other both in terms of our literal career progression and also in terms of our sort of professional pecking order. In order for open access to get anywhere, it's going to need to, if nothing else, look the business. And the difficulty with looking the business is that doing so without extensive experience, though easier now because of a lot of online tools that have lowered the bar for that, it is still difficult. There is still room for that kind of professional credentials, credibility, and skills, I think is what I'm saying. So, yeah, so I've got that kind of difficult tension between the two. I love the idea of open access. I love the idea of being able to find anything that I want and being able to get it for free, and that's wonderful. But on the other hand, if the way that academia is set up, it doesn't really respond very well to that. So.
Other panelists have different roles in publishing. Just to keep going down, Robin, you are with the Thomas Hockley archive. Does that look the business?
Well, not yet. But, so I'm Robin Wharton. I'm a lecturer at Georgia State, and I used to be a copyright lawyer, and I write about copyright issues and modern kind of academic production. And so I approach this as someone who kind of looks at copyright law historically and kind of how it's situated and the kinds of power hierarchies and kinds of economies that it creates currently as a scholar. But then I also look at this primarily as a teacher and then someone who works on a digital project that is geared towards really kind of bringing digital humanities methods into the undergraduate classroom. And so for myself, one of the things that I like about open access is how it brings together what we think of as kind of an inside conversation about work in the academy and how we value that work, and an outside conversation about how we share and publish and communicate using kind of both collaboratively and individually produced materials more broadly. So there's this conversation that's happening outside the academy about copyright and how that affects conditions of work for people outside the academy, but then it's also a conversation that's going on inside the academy. And I like how it brings those two conversations together. So I also like to think about open access in terms of how we could make our work actually more accessible, not just that you could get a PDF offline, but, and this is something that a lot of people talk about too, that you could actually download, that someone who is not a scholar could download one of my articles and read it and understand what I was talking about, right? That is a question about open access as well. And then also that the Hochlieb Archive project that I work on is really sort of thinking about how we can involve students in academic production. And when you're involving students in academic production and they are producing work, then you come up with this additional ethical concern of, will students continue to have access to that work that they produce when they move beyond the institution? And so throwing that up behind a paywall, isn't that doing them a disservice, right? Because they don't necessarily receive any economic benefit. The benefit is from their learning process, but continuing to have access to that, I think, is something that we should kind of promote just as an ethical matter for our students or for members of the community who may contribute to crowdsourced projects and that sort of thing. So I think increasingly, as particularly in the digital humanities, we think about bringing students in to do this work, that we need to think in more creative ways about how to make that work accessible to the public. Because the people doing that work aren't just academics or editors or people who are paid to be doing it, but people who deserve to continue to be able to access and even reuse their work once they're outside the academy and no longer part of the project.
I'm Kevin Harty from Salle University, where I've been department chair for 16 years in the Department of English. And I'm about totally to go to the dark side and go higher up the administrative ladder. I know. I'm also the book review editor of Arthuriana, which is not open site. And my publisher and I brought a lawsuit against a university and won, where on the closed Canvas page for a course, they had digitalized an 800-page book of mine and made it accessible to the students. They argued this was fair use. We did point out that they could simply share the codes for the Canvas page, and anybody could get at the book. And not to sound overly greedy, but royalties are a good thing. I think one of the things you have to be careful about, Arthur Baer made an interesting point in a session earlier this morning, about the dangers of thinking outside the pedagogical norm. I think you have to be careful about thinking about the dangers of thinking outside anything in academia that is the norm. The academy, for as much as we like to think of it as cutting edge, is essentially conservative. And so since I have a fair amount to do with promotion and tenure, and we'll have even more so in the future job, I have great problems convincing English professors what it is poets do and how publishing a poem might be as significant as getting an article in PMLA or Speculum. And since I'm in a discipline that fetishizes the book, how do I explain to a bunch of physicists and School of Business people, where if you do a book, you're not taken seriously, that I have a colleague with an award-winning monograph or an edition of Wordsworth. So I think open access, while it does disseminate information in a whole bunch of ways that are incredibly useful, creates more problems in an area that is already problem-ridden. The academy is essentially not a very nice place sometimes. And when you're trying to make decisions regarding personnel and positions and how you evaluate, we often look to others to do the hard work for us. If you're up for promotion and tenure, you're called upon to find people at other institutions to evaluate your work, often for no money. There's been a long discussion about this on the chair's listserv in the English department group. And one guy wrote in and said, well, you know, why can't we do our own hard work? But that's a voice crying in the wilderness. So if we can agree that a book on popular culture published by Oxford University Press is worthy of promotion to full professor, how are we going to agree that open access, whatever it may mean, is worthy, and what does it mean to be worthy of full professor? So as much as it opens doors in terms of the dissemination of knowledge, it has the potential to close doors in terms of academic evaluation, preferment, and advancement.
Okay, so I'm Leah Haught. I'm a Britt Fellow here at Georgia Tech, and I'm an associate editor for Medievalist Speaking, which is the online review branch for SIM. In grad school, I also worked for 6 years as a staff editor for Meds, so I did the print text of that, then we would have our online, text that become widely available shortly thereafter. And then from Robin's perspective, like I want to build on Robin's perspective too. I would consider myself a teacher, maybe before all of those titles. So for me, for Medievally Speaking, and I would speak as like a non-tenured, junior faculty member, I've had some trouble, not much, but some trouble getting people to agree to do some of those reviews because they are not weighed equally, right? And if you want to do good work and you want to put your name out there publicly, you want to stand by what you do, it takes a while to even just, in the book review format, read that book, write something about it, and send it off. And I really can't, justify some of these responses have been doing that when I'm up for tenure because no one's going to count it. So I do understand that that's, a legitimate issue. But I also think, I was just on the roundtable with Robin and Arthur and several other people, that in the classroom in particular, it has wonderful, wonderful possibilities. I mean, the first assignment I did for the class I was talking about then used Medievally Speaking as a model of, yes, actually, scholars are interested in some of the same things you're doing. They do write and think about how, in Skyrim, the medieval is conceptualized, and model your work after this, and allowing them to go in and see that, and see the different ways that people are having conversations about things they're familiar with, in modes they're familiar with, is really, really important, particularly teaching at a school like this, where most of our books are actually Google books or electronic. So if I'm having them do research projects, and on medieval studies, for instance, we don't happen to have that journal, which guess what, chances are we don't, then they're trying to track down some version of it, and if it's not on JSTOR someplace, that they can easily get it because it's 20 years or older, you run into some real problems in terms of accessibility and what they have access to, and how do you show them how to evaluate that stuff if they can't even get their hands on it in the first place. And then I guess the last thing I would say is that I think a lot of times we think open access is really available or, online publications, and there's still a hierarchy there, it seems to me, which maybe Tom will talk a little bit more about, because we've worked for stuff online that you go, oh, online, that should be accessible to everybody, and yet it is not. So I think part of the problem with the rhetoric is that we can't all agree on what some of these things are.
So I'm Tom Hahn. I teach at the University of Rochester, and I don't really have any coherent statement to make, I think, but a series of kind of anecdotal observations. And so I'll start where Leah just left off with the Middle English Text Series, which are published in print and online almost simultaneously, each volume is. And those volumes are available free and can be downloaded and used and redistributed. First thing to say is that it seems as if the online version has not cut into the print runs, that the hard copy books are still selling pretty well. On the other hand, I think that the only reason that the kind of online materials are available is because the print material had established a kind of long tradition of reliable and durable editions that really kind of serves as the guarantor for the online copy. So the Mets series is now actually starting a new series of books that will only be published online without any hard copy whatsoever. And these, again, will be available free. But I think that the kind of issues of assessment and kind of internal work in terms of promotion and so on that Kevin and Leah both brought up are really, again, going to come into play here since this won't have the same status, it seems to me, as an in-print book. The online versions, unlike the print versions, are sometimes actually changed, revised, expanded, enriched by virtue of remarks or emails sent by people who've used the online copy. So it's possible, in other words, to see this as a kind of collective or collaborative procedure. And yet, clearly the point here, again, is that it's controlled from the top down. In other words, this is managed by the webmaster, who is actually not going to allow people to kind of revise the volume that's online, but rather just to kind of suggest changes. And that seems to me to be an interesting kind of way in which this model works, which is both open access and perhaps not. The latest thing that's happened is that actually the Met series has gone in for a variety of media platforms, Twitter and Facebook. And so I think that they're trying to change the way in which feedback comes to the series and so on and affects what goes on. Just in terms of some other kinds of engagements, the general editor of the Chaucer Bibliographies, which is published by the University of Toronto Press, and with Leah, a co-author of one of the Oxford bibliographies online, First Account of the Green Knight. I actually don't have access to that bibliography because my institution doesn't subscribe to that particular kind of research tool. And I don't think there's any chance that either Oxford or Toronto, as academic presses verging on being commercial presses, are going to actually give up the royalties, the income, the revenue that Kevin was talking about. One last anecdote. On Wednesday, Ruth Evans, who's the executive director of the New Chaucer Society, excuse me, announced that the society had actually signed a deal that day with JSTOR in order to put up all the back volumes of Studies in the Age of Chaucer and to use JSTOR as the kind of platform through which all volumes would now be available. Within less than 24 hours, one of the other trustees wrote in and said, well, what's the status of this in relation to green and gold, open access, and especially the revised, UK standards and so on? There's been like complete silence is the response to that email. I don't think anybody, really is taking this into account or has an established position on it or can really even talk about it in terms that are, reflect a kind of serious knowledge of the status of things. So my sense is, that we're really sort of just barely at the kind of edge of these kinds of issues in terms of open access. And I would include in that the Mets series, which is, it looks like it's open access, but I think in many ways it's really not.
I'm Jesse Swan, professor of English at the University of Northern Iowa, and my research in good measure is concerned the history of print, including then, of course, the Great Revolution, opening up knowledge to more and more people, but then over time, producing things like copyright laws that then constricted access, created marketplaces, all these other sorts of things. But I'm on this panel because I'm also then the editor of a gold open access journal, Universitas, trying to promote the advantages of digital publication, digital archiving, digital searching, managing communication, manipulation. And so the entire journal is always open access, and we have different components to it that have different degrees of traditional print-bound, market-oriented review procedures, and then others that have different ones, more appropriate maybe to a new environment, this sort of thing. And so so that's sort of one of the things that I'm here that I want to talk about. But then the other aspect is called green open access, right? And so that's trying to, and my journal doesn't necessarily deal with that, because if you publish in my journal, it is going to be green open access as well. It's universal. But green open access, right, is when you publish anywhere, before you allow them to publish it, they have to agree or know that you are going to publish it on your own site simultaneously and with your library simultaneously. And so yes, they have it. Sometimes you give them an embargo of a month or a year or something like that, but usually no more than a year, and then you publish it yourself. And of course, all the more highly prestigious places are doing that already. So it's a matter of spreading that throughout the whole academia of, well, I'm concerned about England and America, kind of the West. Anyway, so those are some of the issues that I'm thinking about that I want us all to sort of talk about and raise them in different ways and have your experiences with it too. Yeah.
I have just an anecdotal and fairly limited in scope comment to make, and that's involving interdisciplinary endeavors. My daughter and I published a collection of essays on mathematics and popular culture. And our publisher, of course, made everyone sign the contract saying that they would not make this accessible online until the book had been on the market for 3 years. And those of us in the humanities who had contributed to it said, oh, yeah, well, we're used to this, and signed off. The mathematicians were indignant. They had planned on putting these up on their personal websites immediately because they do that in their field. So I'm wondering if there isn't also a difference in discipline here, and if those of us in the humanities, not us, but them, better us, are hoarders. Are stingier than people in science or mathematics or something like that. They want to share because they are making knowledge that they feel needs to be shared. We feel that way as contributors to this, but our runners, our owners don't. And so I'm wondering if anyone else has that sort of experience with the difference amongst disciplines.
Absolutely.
If I can say a word about that too. I had a science colleague ask me, why would you want to publish a book? Because those don't count when committees look at them. Committees will only look at what they can find online. They won't hunt down an article in print. They won't hunt down a book in print. If they can't find it online, from their point of view, it doesn't exist. It's real. So it's, how do you get past that problem?
Yeah, if I could jump in on that, Ed. I also edited a journal where we moved the reviews online. So it was a print journal. And so I had a really interesting comment from a colleague the other day who said, this is fantastic. Unnamed state university. My school will be basing tenure and promotion decisions exclusively on Google Scholar metrics.
Wow.
So going open access is fabulous. So they're not even the questions that Kevin's bringing up about weighing evaluations. It may get to the point that teams are just saying, oh, it's so much easier. Let's just see how many things they have. In which case the whole system gets no, but that was really interesting that you would say that.
But that's just a variation on a much older system which said, you know, in order to get a full professorship, you needed 18 articles and 6 books. And again, it's this conservatism of the academy where we are, even if we are far from the mathematics department, bean counters.
I can bring up an interdisciplinary example from we're talking this side, I think, like Robin, you mentioned the internal and the external. The tenure part of it, that's the internal part. The outside part, when I was preparing for this panel, I wanted to look up what medievalism was. I had this vague notion sometime in the past, maybe involving knights, so I looked at some journals that we had access to, and I was reading one about video games. Some medievalists wrote about video games and using studying medievalism to influence video games. And in the works, there was cited a scholar named Elizabeth Emery.
That's her.
Oh, okay.
We're all here.
But I noticed that it was cited in a couple of different medievalism, and the actual one I went to look like, okay, well, maybe I can find out what medievalism means, and it was behind a paywall. So, and we're here at Georgia Tech, which is science and technology and engineering, and we don't have a lot of the humanities faculty in here know that we don't have a great humanities collection online. So you didn't have access to that, so I haven't read your article. Yeah.
I'll send you a copy.
But the point is that here at Georgia Tech, you know, making video games is a huge deal here at Georgia Tech. Computer scientists and engineers and stuff, and they're looking to different fields to inform them. And you know, the humanities is going to be one of those fields. History is one of those fields. Medievalism is one of those fields. So that's just a personal example.
So, but this gets back to the question, I think, of evaluation and whether we're looking in terms of internal or external standards, and also where to draw the lines of internal and external. So you've got promotion and tenure committees that are made up probably of people from outside your discipline, but still within the academy. But then you've got also the sort of, so that's a semi-external, right, evaluation. But then you've got this question of whether you want to influence things outside of your field or even outside of academia, and if you do, then you might want to measure yourself, and that's an interesting question, because can you measure yourself if you're using standards that are different from the ones that are accepted within the academy, according to different standards, right? So Google Scholar might be really attractive to some people, and to other people that might look awful in terms of being a way to be evaluated. So I think this is the kind of question that gets raised by open access. Also, the question of disciplinary identity and disciplinary standards, and where do we allow those standards to get impinged upon?
Yeah, to follow up on that, I think that one of the other things that's important to understand the difference between the way that humanists in general respond to open access versus scientists and engineers is also has to do with funding agencies, who have overwhelmingly, I mean, I covered both social science and humanities, all those venues, and a lot of social science venues around medicine, you know, there are lots of funding agencies that require you to be open access, and so the journal will go along with it if you're funded by that agency, because they still want to hire these people if they're, you know. And I think that, you know, it's worth really thinking about, you know, this, like, all of this language of democracy and stuff, which is highly mediated language of democracy, right? Because it's like democracy according to British funding agencies.
But isn't one of the issues that that old distinction that the humanities deal with that which is eternal? That is, we can still read Plato and it's still meaningful, whereas the most recent essay on a technological issue might actually be, you know, overcome by the one that's published 2 weeks from now. And then completely obliterates what has existed before, which is no longer read and no longer meaningful. So is there maybe a parallel between our way of thinking about time and the time it takes to produce text, to publish it, to edit it, and that field difference? That's
actually very interesting. There is, I think it's Ed Larson is a legal scholar who has looked at the effect of copyright on things that are published, and when you look at things that are out of print and in the public domain, things that are still in print, and you know, so, and basically the place where there is just this big hole in the historical record is things that are out of print and still under copyright. And there's no incentive for those to be republished. There, you know, so like, and it really is like just this span of like, I don't know, it was pretty amazing to look at it, like 50 or 75 years of like, just so much of what was published that's out of print that is just basically like not really accessible unless you have access to that library or something like that. So even if I wanted to use one of those books in my class, like I would have to reprint the whole, you know, but it's under copyright, that's illegal. And so it does create this situation where in some fields there's a lot of government pressure, a lot of public pressure for open access. In other fields where there's not, we're losing that, historical record that is so important in the humanities, and that, people like Anne and their research, we don't all just study stuff from the 14th century, we study stuff from 50 years ago or 10 years ago or whatever.
And aren't the humanities, because they deal with human beings, more focused on continuity and continuous meaning as opposed to meaning where the most recent overtakes the penultimate?
Yeah, I mean, you can't get that historical perspective of how, regulatory policy may have evolved over time, or how even, for people like you, Richard, who do these kind of meta studies, right, of the discipline, if you can't get access to that scholarship, you don't really know what the methodology was there. So, so it does create these really weird incentives even within it's not like this perfect market that people kind of imagine, I think, sometimes when they think about copyright.
I hate to bring up this all over, teachers have to think about it. Has anybody been thinking about plagiarism issues? Will it be harder to plagiarize because you can find everything always, or is it easier for students to plagiarize?
I think it's kind of both. I mean, in my experience, I've had students straight up plagiarize from online things, but you can find it really quickly.
You can find it if it's open access.
I'm sorry?
You can find it if it's open access.
Right. Well, yeah, no, that is a good point. But frequently they get stuck in these loops, kind of almost picking up on the language that Robin was using. They get stuck in these loops where you'll notice they have stuff that was published in the last 5 years because they can get their hands on it, and then they have stuff from like 1930 because they can get their hands on it. I'm like, surely something has happened in that field. And the stuff that gets plagiarized is the stuff that's been published in the last 5 years because they get it online. And the stuff that's not plagiarized is from the really old text, and it's, I'm like, that's great that you have old text, but you need, hello, 100 years since, right? So it creates weird loops in their knowledge too, and they think because it's online, I mean, their definition of open access would, I think, challenge all of ours in a way too. They're like, oh, it's online, ergo I can use it however I want. You have to go over all the licensing stuff with them and say, no, you still need to cite, copyright is important.
I mean, that's the sort of, one of the things that I think is particularly important for students is for them to understand that copyright is really just a different thing from their ethical responsibilities as an author and as someone who's learning to participate in a discipline to provide attribution and citation and that sort of thing. And I think one of the things that is that can be kind of the downside of open access and copyright is that it just takes over all of our discourse about plagiarism and citation and attribution and that sort of thing. And this is, I think, where medievalism can actually come into this conversation, is that it becomes the whole vocabulary that we use to talk about everything, so that plagiarism becomes stealing, and it's, but if I'm a student and I've paid someone to write an essay for me, and they say, yes, you can turn this essay in your classes, and I own that, that's not even a copyright violation. There's an argument there that I have an implied license, right? Or that I'm like the publisher, paid the author to transfer the copyright to me, right? And so how do you explain that that's plagiarism? It's not stealing, it's not a copyright violation, but we can look back to how intellectual work was regulated in a pre-copyright situation, right? And I tell my students, if it was published in the 19th century, it's not under copyright anymore, but you still have to cite it, So yeah, I think, Leah brings up a really good point, and the plagiarism, I think, is a point where we might kind of begin to break apart some of the issues that are maybe getting in the way of a conversation about this.
I'm sorry.
Do you think that open access might change our definition of plagiarism just beyond stealing? Because in medieval text and in the early modern period, what plagiarism might have been in their eyes is very different from what plagiarism is in our eyes. And so lifting an entire passage from someone's work and incorporating it into your own in a way that, even if you don't acknowledge it, and may slightly, even just ever so slightly change its meaning, is considered appropriate. But, just putting your name on someone else's work would not be appropriate. Whereas today we would view that both as plagiarism.
For that, we should probably go back before printing. The Greeks had a concept called logoklopia, the stealing of words, and their society worked just fine I mean, I'm saying, you know, sometimes if we historicize the situation, we might as well go back before copyright and you know, Renaissance, Middle Ages, or even further, and think that societies had ways of dealing with the rights of authors, of originality, authority, you know, in ways that are completely compatible with the societies at the time. So I think, obviously, since the 18th century, that has changed tremendously. But I think, you know, the situation we have right now is not the only one possible. Also important, I think, is to note that not all countries deal with copyright and intellectual property right as the United States does. There are countries that deal with it in a much more reasonable manner, that don't extend every time something seems to go out of copyright, the time that copyright is valid, you know, just to satisfy the pockets of the people who are involved in that. So I'm thinking, well, Germany, for example, is much more progressive in that way.
Well, and the, you know, that sort of the regulatory model, like when we think about what copyright is, it's a everyone explains it like simple. It's a bundle of rights, like all property rights. And so there's the right to reproduce, there's the right to make derivative works, there's the right to, you know, remediate something, there's the right to translation and stuff like that. And I think we need to start talking about how to maybe separate those rights. And also, open access is ultimately like a private solution to a public problem in a way. And what we really have is, I'm just going to go out and say it, like a Copyright Act that I think in some ways no longer reflects the reality of the way that people think about how work should be circulating and used and that sort of thing, either inside the academy or outside of it. And so I think what would be great is to see the open access conversation going into, you know, really sort of how the conversation that people are having about legislation and how we might reform the law that we have, rather than kind of trying to work in the interstices of the regulatory system.
I'm trusting to memory on here. Wasn't it only in, I believe, 1774, correct me if memory is failing, that there was a legal case, a case in which it was determined that what one wrote was one's personal property, that is individual property. It was actually defined that the law that we have been following in this country is based on British law, and what we're talking about here, if we find open access desirable, is communal property. So we're introducing a communistic, or communalism, is it? No, here, in the face of a 200-some-year-old.
Well, I mean, the Constitution presumes that everything is in the public domain in the absence of copyright law, and sort of so in its constitutional formulation, copyright is an incentive for authors to create so that there will be a robust public domain to create this marketplace of ideas and that sort of thing. And Ty Harrington, who's actually on the faculty in literature, media, and communication, writes about this very well. And so, yeah, so the idea is always, as formulated in Anglo-American systems, again, because it's very different. Richard might be able to talk a little, I mean, because in Europe, moral rights and the idea of the personal property right, like personal as identified with your person, is much more sort of a much more significant influence in the law. But in the Anglo-American system, the whole point is to have, like, ultimately stuff falls out of copyright, and so we have this great public domain that people can draw on and read, and, you know, like, so that innovation breeds innovation. And so, but what we now have is a system that really, that kind of flips it on its head. So we have we have a public domain from, you know, like January 1st, 1922. It's sort of like everything before then is definitely in the public domain, and then after then it's kind of, well, it depends.
One promise of open access, though, and those people, those of us participating in it, pushing it, is to, in a way, and this is maybe Robin Hood open access, to ignore these bureaucratic oppressions and laws and just practice, just be different. And the laws actually came into existence because people were different from generations before, and so then laws changed. You know, previous regulations, as Richard points out, how they managed things, fell away, new ones came into existence. So lots of open accesses. Don't pay attention to this, you know, until the police get you or something. Practice, be different. Gaming, and so that's why Georgia Tech is such a great place to be discussing this. Gaming offers a great model for this, and it uses a literary device often called illusion. So we can see medievalism in a game, right? There's no reference to it. There's no reference to the author, this sort of thing. But only very ignorant people don't get the illusion. It's clearly stated without being stated. That's a literary technique, illusion, right? That's how you get it. That's what open access does. And this closed access is a historically specific anxiety over my ignorance when I'm having to evaluate someone else, and I just then use a bureaucratic means to supply my ignorance. Whereas open access says we're actually very smart. We actually know lots of stuff, and I get your illusion. It's not plagiarism. It's a smart reproduction of something that came before. So I think that's, and I'd like to hear if anybody in here is a gamer, especially making games, and sort of say how you do that now in an open access way. The problem with gaming, though, is sometimes it's closed access, right? You have to buy the games, and I mean, so the free apps that are games, that's true open access, right? Using all these kinds of things.
Yeah. I think, did you mention Skyrim? I think this is Skyrim is an example of this. There was like a whole lawsuit that came between Minecraft and Skyrim because they were somehow two related, even though they're extremely different games. Yeah. And the creators of Skyrim didn't necessarily agree with that, so they put a little pickaxe, but it was like kind of pixelated and stuff like that into the game to pay tribute to this, like their support of Minecraft. And by doing that, they weren't necessarily saying, "Oh, I'm agreeing with Minecraft," or even saying Minecraft, but everyone who played games knew exactly what they were referencing.
It's a good example.
Well, one of the reasons we need to discuss open access is really about something else. It is about the fact that when we teach at a public university, there is that question, who owns what we do? My quick approach to this is simply this. Some time ago at a different institution, I had a colleague who had produced a publication as an employee of the state at a state university as part of his research. And then he made his students at that institution use that textbook in his classes and earned royalties based on that. Okay? And of course, the question was then brought to him by administrators who said, well, if that happens somewhere else outside of our state, that's one thing. But you know, we paid you specifically, and you got tenure and promotion specifically to produce this kind of work, and now you're charging our students, you know, who pay for their education, and your salary is paid by them in part, for access to that work. And so I know specifically in some states in the United States that the real question was, well, we have to do something about that, you know, and make it easier, you know, for students to have access to the relevant research. Now, textbooks are a specific case, I realize that, but you know, that was one of the reasons why so many people, so many politicians in specific state governments were so much in favor of so-called open access. Now, they imagine something, again, very specific and very targeted against such sometimes abusive.
Richard, was the argument there that you shouldn't be using his textbook, or that the school should get the royalties?
No, the administrator in case was actually quite enlightened, and it was really about the students at that institution who should not have to pay for something that he had been asked to do while he was gainfully employed by that university.
I could see someone interested in revenue streams arguing that the school should get the
That wasn't the case.
You can sell all you want.
I'd like to come back to something that you said, that where open access is like a community practice, because the law, copyright law, is pretty confusing and pretty out of date. So open access is like something that we do as an academic community to react to that. So I want to, if I can, get some feedback from the panel members that are doing things that are open in some form or another. What's the motivation to be part of that community of openness?
The motivation for doing?
Mm-hmm.
So actually, I think that the question of business models that was raised in the questions that were circulated first is a really interesting one, because it seems to me that in terms of the projects that I was just talking about, those ones that are with academic commercial publishers are for profit. There's no question about it. Whereas Teams has been generously supported by the NEH for quite a long time now. And so it really actually mimics the kind of scientific funding of research, in that it makes it sort of easier to distribute, and there's no need for the project to be self-sustaining in terms of its income and revenue. But it's also interesting to me that the Studies in the Age of Chaucer issue with JSTOR, the Chaucer Society regards that revenue stream as a really important feature of its budget, of its operating budget. And so I think that the Chaucer Society would feel it had lost some really important kind of feature of what it can do, how it runs its conferences and so on, if it didn't actually have an agreement of this sort. It couldn't do it, or simply went, open access and self-archived. So I think that we have several different kinds of models there. In other words, a for-profit commercial model, a foundation funding model, and then a society that's actually looking to increase its revenue because it doesn't have, besides subscriptions or memberships, it doesn't have any other source of income.
So I want to add also another perspective to this, which is the individual researcher perspective. Because I think there are these institutions out there that are thinking this through and thinking it through in kind of a technical way. But I think that as an individual researcher, I see these institutions out there, and then there are legal things like copyright, and then policies, perhaps at universities like at Georgia Tech for open access, and how can I operate as an individual scholar within all of those institutions? And just to give you one example of how I've tried to do this, I found online my dissertation that was being put out as a PDF for sale in China. And royalties are good, but nobody asked me about this, right? And so what I tried to do was, so I got my PhD in 2004, and Emory is where I got my PhD, and it was just after that they started publishing open access electronic theses and dissertations online. So I went to the library there and I said, will you publish mine online and make it freely available, in order to undermine these people in China who are profiting off of my work? So I mean, I think there are just various ways of maneuvering around these things, and I think that one of the things we should do as individuals is think about how each of us, we want to do that, but also we should think about how, in terms of a discipline, we want to position ourselves relative to the larger sort of infrastructure out there. So you think in terms of how do we want to do it as a journal, how do we want to do it as a discipline, how do we want to do it as individuals?
I mean, the dissertation model you suggest is interesting. I'm much older than you. So that when I finished my dissertation in 1974, I had to assign the rights to University Microfilms at the University of Michigan, which then sold, I, out of vanity once looked, 312 copies of it to various universities around the world. And I didn't see a cent. But, that was a sort of open access. And complicating this even further, we're in the middle of a huge battle with the university lawyers about intellectual property. And I'm not about to, I think, patent any genome or anything else like that as a professor of English. But I do have colleagues in biology and chemistry and various others who may be so fortunate, and the university wants a piece of the pie, and the funding agency probably wants a piece of the pie. And I suppose part of my response, if NEH is funding teams, since we love to beat up on the NEA and the NEH and say taxpayer money shouldn't go into funding people who dip themselves in chocolate. But it could go into this, so you better not charge for it because I paid for it.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But that's because that's NEH funded. So I mean, again, this thing becomes sort of a Pandora's box as soon as you open it, because there are a lot of things in there that kind of bump into each other. The right to know, the right to disseminate, the right to protect. I think there's a fundamental difference between the ways in which scholars in the humanities view their work and scholars in the non-humanities. We tend to think of ourselves as not public figures. There are rare people who are humanities professors that are public figures, whereas I think people in STEM may be more likely to be on the news than I am, talking about sentence fragments in the latest voter initiative or something like that. But you know, anybody who has any background in infectious disease is on the news every night about Ebola. So we may have done this to ourselves in the way, as you said, that we view the humanist. But where are the Camille Pagulias and the people like that who make the evening news as spokespersons who happen to be humanists?
Even in the private space, if you want to call it private space of your classroom, like going back to the Oxford Online bibliographies, like I don't have access to that either, and I'm a co-author of that. I think we undermine ourselves when we can't even show our own work in our classroom because we don't own it anymore, or because no matter how many acrobatic backflips we try to show them how to, you can maybe get it through interlibrary loan. Like I've given my students my Arthurian access info before because they've not been able to get info onto it. I'm like, don't go crazy, but let's go in here and find the articles you need so you can write your wiki page or whatever. Yeah, so I think we undermine ourselves even as semi-public, semi-private intellectuals if we can't say, yes, here's my body of work, I know how it's being used, I can share it with you as I see fit, et cetera, et cetera.
One of the things we have to come back to is to actually read each other's work.
Yes, yes, yes.
And what I mean by that, specifically when we talk about tenure and promotion situations, where we decide to farm out the responsibility for work that we should do ourselves. Yeah. Now, it is true that in departments, and we have one of those here, right, where we don't have enough specialists in each area, that is a legitimate concern. But on the other hand, to do what others do, to look at an H index, or other ways, or a Google citation index, is the application of our own way of reading each other's work, appreciating it, evaluating it, to machines.
And that's what gamers do. They read each other's work, and you see their reading of their work in the games they produce themselves. So that's why, again, open access gamers can be models for the new academics.
Well,
go ahead.
I was just thinking about, Carolyn Dinshaw, who is a medievalist, wrote a really great, important new book about amateur medievalists and sort of the role of the amateur in medieval scholarship historically. And I just spent sort of 2 years working as an adjunct, working as a independent, unaffiliated scholar, and it has become almost impossible to do that work. Because as, you can go into the library and if they have something on their shelves, then you can use it. But if it's not available on the library shelves, it's usually not here at Georgia Tech. Or it's, maybe it's available at Emory, but you can't always get access there. It can be really, I was pretty much unable to do any work, during this semester or so when I just wasn't teaching anywhere. And just who gets excluded by, it's not just that the academy, that we need to regulate ourselves, but that we're excluding the possibility that we might have amateur scholars who I think all of us, whether we work in chemistry or biology or philosophy, I'm sure there's in every discipline a history of amateur scholarship there that has contributed in some significant way, and you're kind of foreclosing that possibility.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and the one thing that I noticed, one of the most incredible things that I noticed when I started doing the public medievalist was I sort of had a sense that there was a hunger within the wider public for well-pitched articles about the sorts of things we're interested in, what we do. I had no idea, because the first week of that website being live, I got a little bit over 10,000 unique visitors to that website. And part of it was due to a crazy social media marketing push, but also part of it is because people were genuinely interested. And so I think one part of the discussion we haven't really touched on at all is, well, although Kevin actually touched on it a little bit, is whether or not we should be and can be engaging with wider publics. Not necessarily for our own immediate professional benefit, but just for a, I don't know, philanthropic, or sort of this idea that we're here not just to increase the knowledge of the academy, but more generally. And so even though, and so when you ask the question, why do you do it? I mean, even though I know I'm getting no brownie points from anybody for doing it and putting a lot of time into it, that's why I do it, because I'm passionate about genuine public engagement. That's why I do it.
This whole argument of getting more people involved kind of reminds me of the music industry, and that people lament the death of the music industry when people were using Napster, and now it's kind of impossible to quash these download services where you can get music really easily. There's certain sub-genres of metal, like drone doom metal and all these weird things like that have actually thrived because they're actually able to reach a larger audience. And now that they've been able to do that, there's like a store in New York City in the Village that only sells vinyl records and they're only metal records, and it's able to survive because it's reached this larger audience. So it hasn't actually killed the genre; it's actually expanded and made it stronger. Is that something that could possibly happen with these type of small subgenres of academia?
I think that's a good question, and I think it's a good question for you to be talking about here. I'm just grouping you as a medievalist or a medievalism scholar. I'm assuming 90% of the people here.
That moment of hesitation was worth the entire conversation.
But I mean, I think that this kind of conversation is precisely the kind of conversation you all should be having as a discipline, as individuals, as members of the structure of higher education. How do we want to package this to present ourselves and to engage with a larger audience? Do we want it just to be a conversation among ourselves where we can have very high standards of rigor and where we know what counts as good and what doesn't? Or do we want to make it possible to engage a much larger audience and then have perhaps different standards to judge that kind of work? There's a movement in philosophy called public philosophy right now that is, it's in this quasi realm of is it real philosophy or not? Well, of course it's not, right? Well, but of course it is. Yeah. And so we're having this conversation now in philosophy in a way that I think is super healthy. And then tying it to things like open access, copyright, existing institutions, super important, I think. Promotion and tenure criteria.
Let's not forget that the amateurism that you just talked about is actually that got all of us started. And that many of the works we still use, many of the editions we still use, were actually produced by that core of so-called amateurs, or dilettantes, as they called themselves very proudly, and they're no longer so proudly, between 1850 and the 1920s. And that we're actually going away from such a public engagement, that was about to build, might be a problem. I am absolutely sure that in medievalism studies, for no other reason than the history of this area of engagement, we need to publish as much full open access as we can. I think that should be the society's goal, and if somebody hasn't read the review on Medievally Speaking, then that's their problem, right? Because the quality is there, and the quality is guaranteed by us as editors, as authors. And again, we should not abdicate that responsibility and simply say, by virtue of the fact that something gets published in A, it must be better than something that's published in B. That system has never fully worked, and it will not work in the future.
Well, Chaucer was an amateur, and he read his own work in public.
But as somebody who does a lot of scholarship on kooks,
Right.
On the one hand, he wants quality control. As somebody who spent a lot of time reading conspiracy theory and like really far out stuff, you know, on the other hand, I also want my work to get read. So
Right.
I increasingly take especially older things that I felt never got read at the time onto academia because, and now all of a sudden people read stuff like, you know, I showed Science that came out in 2005. I don't think the Medievalist ever read it. It was on intellectual property in France. And no one's read it, so I put it on like media, and now I can get someone to read it. You know, it's like now people read it. And so as somebody who has been a full professor for 20 years, I don't worry that much about promotion. I mean, I worry about my own problems stuff, but I want people to read my work. And so I want to make it as fully accessible as I can.
I think we've run up against our allotted time. Thanks to everyone who was on the panel, who agreed to participate. Audience.